So, topical discussion on BBC One Scotland, starting now with David Dimbleby.
Tonight we're in Dewsbury, and welcome to Question Time. And on our panel tonight, the Conservative MP who challenged John Major for the leadership of the party, John Redwood, the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Rachel Reeves, the Liberal Democrat MP and Parliamentary Private Secretary to Nick Clegg, Joe Swinson, the historian, David Starkey, and from the trade union with the highest paid membership in the country, the chairman of the Professional Footballers Association, Clark Carlisle. And David Chandler has our first question.
Should the Chancellor resist calls from business leaders and his own backbenchers to remove the 50% tax on high earners?
There's been a big appeal today for this, that in the next budget the 50% tax, income tax, is reduced. John Redwood, would you like to see the Chancellor do that?
I think we do need to get more money from the rich. I agree with finding ways to tax the rich more. And I do think the ways to successfully tax the rich more would include taking the rate of tax back to the Labour level of 40% from the 50%. We see in the January figures this year that income tax receipts are actually down from self-assessment compared with the year earlier. Exactly what some of us said would happen if we persevered with this 50% tax rate. A lot of bright people are not working as hard, some are leaving the country, some are not setting up enterprises here, some are finding other clever ways of routing their monies elsewhere, and so we are losing revenue. I think it's stupid to lose revenue when we need the rich to pay more. The top 1% of taxpayers do pay 30% of the income tax already. I'd like them to make a bigger contribution. The way to do it is to cut the rate.
Right. And what chance the Chancellor hearing your voice and agreeing with you and doing it?
I'm sure he will hear my voice. I think getting him to agree is a little more difficult because he will be swayed, perhaps, by all those people who say this is not the time to give the rich a tax break. I am saying this is the time to get more off the rich, and I believe in pragmatic politics, things that work.
Rachel Reeves, do you agree with him?
Well, I think that the government should prioritise not the 1%, the richest 1% in the country, but the other 99%, the people who are struggling with their household bills, with their mortgage payments, their rents, the gas and electricity bills, petrol prices, all those things going up. And yet ordinary families facing that huge squeeze with inflation rising at a higher rate than wages. So I don't think a priority right now should be cutting taxes for the top 1%. The Conservatives are obviously straining at the leash to get rid of this tax, but I think that the Chancellor should put ordinary families first. And Labour are prioritising a cut in VAT back down to 17.5%, which would put £450 in the pockets of an average family, and also a national insurance holiday for small businesses taking on new workers. I think that those are the priorities right now, priorities that get money to ordinary families and businesses, not prioritising the very wealthiest 1% in this country.
What do you make of the argument that was put that by cutting it from 50 to 40%, you would actually encourage growth in the economy? Do you think that's just not true?
Well, the government have commissioned a review, asked the Revenues and Customs Department to have a look at this, to see how much money it's raising. But the latest predictions are that the increase in the top rate of tax from 40 to 50% for people earning more than £150,000 will bring in around £3 billion.
That's not what I asked you. I asked you whether reducing it would stimulate the economy, because people would be inclined. John Redwood said people weren't working because they had to pay so much tax.
I'm not convinced by that. I think that what would stimulate the economy would be a cut in VAT that would help ordinary families and would get money into our shops and retail sector, and also a reduction in national insurance for small businesses who are really struggling with a lack of bank lending and the lack of demand in the economy. So the tax cut should go to ordinary people, not the very wealthiest 1%.
Well, I want a tax rise, and the way to get it is to set a rate they'll pay. Your party in office for 13 years kept the rate at 40% for very good reasons, because Mr Brown understood that was the maximum to maximise the revenue from this group of people. Now you're in opposition, you want to destroy the tax revenue base. Can you explain why income tax didn't go up in January this year?
John, the budget deficit has got to be addressed, and I think it's right that those people with the broadest shoulders should contribute something to bringing it down, which is why the top rate of tax for people earning more than 150,000, the top 1%, why their tax rate was increased. I think that's the right thing to do. It shouldn't just be ordinary families and businesses shouldering the burden.
What's the Liberal Democrat line on this, Jo Swinson? Are they in agreement? You wanted to see it cut? Are you, like John Redwood, wanting to put pressure on the Chancellor?
Well, I mean, in answer to David's question, then I think the Chancellor should resist these calls.
You like the 50% tax?
Well, look, there's probably about 100 people in this room here. I think it would send out a very strange signal if the Chancellor's budget said that the priority was to give the top earning person in this room a tax cut and not anybody else. That's really the situation that we're looking at. What he should be doing is helping hard-working families and taxpayers, and I've certainly proposed, and so have my colleagues in the Liberal Democrats, that should be done by taking low and middle income earners out of paying tax altogether or giving them a tax cut of £60 a month by raising the tax threshold further and faster towards £10,000. That will also stimulate the economy, it will get people spending, and it'll be money back in people's pockets when they're finding things difficult at the moment.
David Starkey.
This is a fascinating instance, isn't it, of the war between heart and head. It is perfectly clear that to cut the 50% rate of tax at the moment looks wrong. Everybody with a heart, which John notoriously doesn't have, understands that. And remember, he was beamed in from outer space, so he's completely inhuman. On the other hand, of course...
You don't have to insult a panellist to win an argument.
I'm flattering him. I regard
Well, please tell me when you're going to insult me.
I regard the great problem of British politics as exemplified by Labour and the Lib Dems as an absolute slushy, mindless sentimentality that refuses to think. We're in a position, because of the complete wreckage of the public finances left by Labour, that we have to increase tax revenue. There is no way round that. The issue is how we do it without destroying the economy and with also getting the economy moving again. Not little posturing like somebody who should be ashamed if she's Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury of this cheap posturing. Now, we have had an experiment...
Sorry, David, there's nothing cheap about saying that you would prioritise ordinary families over the top 1%. That's not cheap. That's just making a realistic priority.
No, it's
right
not,
now,
because what you're doing is you're proposing to reduce the tax take by lifting those families and those little businesses out. Let us address the real question, which is how we increase it. We had a controlled experiment. The last long period of Labour government in the country before New Labour took tax rates up to 98%. They were then cut by the great reforming Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, whereupon the tax take from the rich at times virtually doubled. Exactly. Now, sorry, this is the head. I know ladies like the heart, but John and I, both heartless, can actually decide that the head must rule.
Okay. Woman up there. Woman up there in the middle at the back.
Putting aside your opinions on women...
Oh, don't, please.
I can think of a good way that we can get more from tax without changing the rate, and that's to crack down on tax avoidance by large companies.
Okay. And the man in the middle, you said that.
Can we make an agreement at the outset, please? We leave the propaganda and party posturing about the ruination of the economy with the last government at the door, not on the table. And I'm sorry.
Why? Okay. Why?
Because
of
that is exactly what it is, propaganda.
No, it's not, it's fact. And if you can't recognise fact, you shouldn't be at a programme like this.
You don't like it. You don't like the propaganda comment.
Why do you have the insolence to think that your opinion is better than anybody else's?
Where is yours?
Why can't you argue a case?
You want to talk?
Argue a case. No, I argue a case. He's not doing. He's just sort of coming in rather like a preacher, waving down the tablets of the law. I'm bored of Moses.
No,
there were lots of Moses in this
But
place.
David, you're the one that's just insulted half the women in the room.
And members of the panel.
I was just doing a quick.
Oh, just two of us.
Both of you adopting exactly the same.
Actually,
He was
it's
simply
not the same to you, because
David Starkey, he was simply saying that it is political posturing to go on and on about who's responsible
No, it's
for
not.
this.
It's vital that we understand
All right,
what's happening.
let me bring
and
in
what has
Clark
to be done.
Carlisle. I'll come to you, Joe. Clark Carlisle.
Well, it's no secret to everyone that the majority of our membership will, encounter the 50% tax bracket.
This is the footballers.
Yes, yeah. We have 3,000 members, and
Bad
in the top
tax
two,
advisors.
and in the top two divisions, most of those guys will fall under the 50% tax bracket. But let me tell you, they are more than happy to contribute in any way they can to support the recovery of the economy. But I think the salient point about this is defining an overt show of a popular decision over actual rational decisions. And I think it's going to be a recurring theme of what I'm going to say on topics tonight, is that the government doesn't seem to be asking the right people about the decisions that it's making. Now, when you're going to take decisions that affect businesses up and down the country, you ask the people in those businesses. And if those guys are telling you that raising the tax bracket to 50% is driving the top earners out of the country so that they either pay their taxes elsewhere, or it reduces their chances of expanding the country to create more taxes, then surely they're the people who we should be listening to on this topic, and not someone who's come up with an idea that will be very popular with the masses from Whitehall.
Okay. The woman up there. Yes, woman there, and then come to the gentleman over here. Yes.
As a woman who most definitely thinks with her head and not her heart, surely it should be time to stop prioritising this tax cut and this tax cut, and instead cut tax to a flat rate across the board, and then cut the deficit by taking the revenue, the lower, admittedly perhaps revenue, but more likely to be higher due to the Laffer curve, and then use that to cut the deficit instead of stop taking money off rich people and poor people alike.
You would like a flat rate tax, literally.
Yeah.
John Redwood, would you support that, the Laffer curve argument?
Well, I support the argument that certain taxes become a problem if you put the rate too high. You can see that with income tax, you can see it with capital gains tax. And I think at the moment we so desperately need the revenue, we've got to optimise all the rates. We've got to set the best rate for collecting the maximum revenue. And I think that is head and heart, David. Mm-hmm. I care very much to reduce the tax burden on people on low pay, and I don't think rich people deserve a tax cut. I just want to get more money out of them, and the only way I can see of doing that is to have a rate that they will pay in Britain in a very competitive world where they've got other options. And I'm delighted that footballers want to make a bigger contribution, but I think quite a lot of footballers find all sorts of tax planning arrangements and offshore devices which enable them not to pay.
Well, John, I'm sure that this is a topic that will... I'm sure that this is a topic that we'll come to later with what's going on with Barclays, but minimising tax liability is something that every business person in this country does, from greengrocers right up to the other end of the scale. So to castigate one group of people for doing that in a legal way is completely incorrect. But the thing about Barclays is the fact that they're actually in contravention to the banking code, and that's why they should be held accountable for those decisions.
Okay. The gentleman up there, I said I'd come to.
Isn't the way to improve the tax intake to stop the loopholes, such as individuals setting themselves up as companies, as we've seen in government recently?
Okay.
Can I just come back on
Very briefly, Joe, because I want to move on. We've got a lot of questions here.
Regardless of the sexism, which I have to say, David, does you no credit, nor does it help your argument. Actually, I'm arguing something very different to what Rachel is saying. Because, again, want to talk. What I'm arguing is not for unfunded tax cuts like the Labour Party. The Liberal Democrats are saying cut taxes for hard-working families by increasing the taxes on the wealthiest in society. And there are a range of ways of doing that. It's not that the 50p rate is sacred. We're already getting £7 billion extra in through cutting down on tax avoidance, £2.5 billion extra from the banks, and we need to look at other ways of doing this. And I think the Treasury review to see the best ways that we can make sure the wealthiest in society pay their fair share is what we need to do. It's a fairer tax system that's important, so we help people on low incomes and the wealthier people
David,
pay more.
No, you can't. No, you can't. I'm sure you'll have plenty of time to make all the points you want, but I want to go on because it's Done a quarter of an hour so far. We've only done one question. If you have comment on this, remember, of course, you can join in the debate. If you're tweeting our hashtag BBCQT, if you want to text us, 83981, the red button, or CFAX page 155. We'll tell you what others are saying. Let's go on to this question from Hannah May, please. Hannah May.
A motion released by some Lib Dem members today describes the Health and Social Care Bill as so deeply flawed that it's not possible to make it fit for purpose. Are they right?
I make no apologies for going back to the NHS. Of all the questions we've had this season, it's been top of the list, and it is once again here today in Dewsbury. And it's a question directed at the Liberal Democrats, so Joe Swinson, you can answer it first, which is you've got a lot of members going to their conference and saying that this whole Health and Social Care Bill is deeply flawed and is not possible to make it fit for purpose. Do you agree with that? And if the Liberal Democrats at their conference vote for this, will your party say, we pull back, we won't support it any longer?
Well, I disagree with the members who are putting this forward, but I absolutely agree with their right as democratic members of the party to put this forward and debate it at the party conference in a week or so's time. And our party conferences have a reputation for having very frank and open debates, and it's very important that we do listen to our members. But the reason
but you don't take a blind bit of notice of what they
That's not true. I tell you how that's not true at all,
Legalised
David.
cannabis, I remember, was one, wasn't it?
Well, another one, David, was last spring conference where there was a motion about the NHS, and the Liberal Democrats put forward a range of concerns, genuine concerns about the bill. And since then, over the last year, methodically within Parliament, in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, my colleagues Paul Burstow, Shirley Williams, Judith Jolly, have been working tirelessly to improve this bill. So it's now a very different beast to what it was a year ago.
Is it now deeply flawed or not? Is it a bill you now support?
It is a bill that I do support. There's some further debates in the House of Lords on the issues of competition, where my Liberal Democrat colleagues are working with the government about further safeguards to make sure that any private income that comes in is used for the good of NHS patients, because that's the people that matter in all of this. It's about how we can make sure we have a health service that delivers for you, the patient, so that it's free at the point of use, that you go along and you will have a good service. And it is facing huge challenges. We had many years with large investment, extra investment every year in the NHS, which when the times were good was possible to do. Now, the coalition government has protected NHS spending, which the Labour Party weren't going to do, but because the costs of the NHS go up so much each year, £600 million extra a year just on the drugs bill, for example, that actually feels very difficult for the NHS. So we do need to get more efficient, cut out some of the middle management, put decision-making back in the hands of the family doctors and the other clinicians, and that will actually start to save £1.5 billion every year that can go into providing NHS services for everyone to use.
Thank you. Rachel Reeves, do you agree with that analysis?
I fundamentally disagree with what Joe has just said. At the general election, David Cameron said there would be no more top-down reorganisation of the NHS. He said he would listen to doctors and to nurses and people who use the National Health Service day in, day out. And over the last few weeks, despite all these changes that Joe says the Liberal Democrats have made, doctors, GPs, surgeons, nurses, midwives, radiologists, psychiatrists have all come out and criticised this bill. They're all urging the government to drop the bill.
Are you convinced, when you look at the actual figures, that a majority of those organisations are coming out? Or, as seems the case with some of them, only a small number of people replying? The Royal College of General Practitioners, 44,000 members, only 2,600 answered the question. Well, physiotherapists, only 1,100 answered out of 50,000 members.
I don't know
are we getting a true picture, in your view? I mean, you're a politician, you study these things.
And I don't know if there are doctors and nurses, people who use the health service in this audience today, but the vast majority of people I talk to in my constituency, doctors, nurses, patients of the National Health Service, are also saying to the government, I've had more letters on this than on anything else.
But you do think it's a majority? I mean, the opponents of this always say everybody's against it, but when you look at the figures, it doesn't quite look like that.
Well, I mean, I just haven't met a single doctor or nurse in my constituency who wants the government to go ahead with this. But shall I just tell you the reasons why? Well, because Jo says that the NHS faces unprecedented pressures, and she's right. But the way to address those pressures isn't to spend more than £3 billion on this top-down reorganisation.
It's a furious figure. It's
There's
not
more
correct.
than there's 3,000 fewer nurses now than there were at the time of the general election. The government say there'll be 6,000 by the time of the next general election. The fact is, money's being ploughed into this reorganisation and being taken away from the front line.
There are more doctors and fewer administrators already, and that is what they're trying to do.
There are 3,000 fewer nurses.
Under Labour,
I'm sure that doctors and nurses
managers increased at 3 times the rate of nurses in the NHS.
All right, let's get into an argument about this.
The Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives
Hold on. OK, we get the picture that you disagree, and we want to talk about whether this bill is deeply flawed and should fail. But we must have some members of working there. You, sir, up there, you're not by any chance in the NHS?
I confess that I have not read the bill, which is passing through Parliament currently, but my perception is that it is certainly moving in the right direction, because it is aiming to devolve decision-making to doctors, nurses and other health professionals. It's taking it away from the expensive bureaucracies that have hitherto done that.
Are you an NHS?
I have worked in the NHS part-time for almost 10 years. I was the chair of the board managing the local hospital here, Dewsbury Healthcare.
Are you going to be abolished? Is that being abolished under this scheme?
Well, I can tell you that devolving decision-making to the staff actually works. I can tell you from personal experience that that is the case.
OK, the woman over. Lady here.
If the bill's so good, why has it taken up so much parliamentary time to make it fit for purpose?
Why is it taking...
Why is there so much improvement needed if it's so good?
John Redwood, why is it taking so long to get this through?
Well, because Labour and some trade unions have decided to make this their big campaign to try and stop it, and they obviously have the attention of some in the media. I don't find, as Rachel does, that this is a matter of great controversy in my constituency. I've had very few letters and emails about it, and my general practitioners and district nurses are just getting on and implementing it because they like it and they want to make a success of it. It is about giving better treatment to patients. It is about spending more of the money on the treatment and the medical professionals and less on the bureaucracy. It is about giving the GPs more power with their patients to choose the best treatment for them. I think those are all completely laudable aims, and it is not in any sense about privatising or about making profits out of people. This is free care that we all believe in through the NHS, and more of the money is going to be spent on the care. Now, what is there to dislike?
Well, under these proposals, John, 49% of beds in hospitals and theatre places can be taken up by private patients, and that's not the case at the moment. So it is about undermining the National Health Service.
The man in the third row there.
Personally, I'd like to see the cuts getting deeper. I was reading the other day in an article that a bag of gluten-free pasta was costing NHS £40 a bag, and in fact they were advising people to just go and buy it from the shop because it was cheaper than that. And when they're tied up in ridiculous contracts like that, that's when you need to put that £40 could be so many people's prescriptions.
OK, the woman up there in the third row from the back.
Yeah, I'm a public sector worker. I don't actually work for the NHS, but I think in terms of figures, I think most of us are actually browbeaten and fed up of filling forms in, and so the figures might be skewed, but if you speak to people on the ground, you might get a truer picture.
And do you think, in your experience, are people behind this Lansley proposals or against?
No, I think the majority are against.
Against, and you, sir, with the moustache there on the left. Yes, you've got.
Why wasn't it in the Tory manifesto before the election?
Why what? Sorry.
Why wasn't it in the Tory manifesto before the election?
Okay.
There were 3 pages on it, setting out the need for choice and for GP empowerment.
OK, I'll take one more point down up there, then I'll come to you, Clark. Yes, you, sir.
I think more people, and the majority of people, would rather have extra practice nurses than a practice manager for the same amount of money.
Clark Carlisle.
Well, this will go back to something I mentioned before about asking the right people for me. You know, Joe just said there that they're going to listen to the party members at the conference, but I spent a couple of hours in my local haematology unit at Northampton General Hospital that had just had an overhaul that it's still yet to pay for. They're trying to raise funds for it. And it was just 2 hours with the nurses and doctors there who selflessly give of themselves on a daily basis to try and make a difference to someone else's lives. Now, after just 2 hours, I know that I couldn't do that job. That's not a job, that's a vocation, it's a calling. And when these people are telling me that this reform bill is not good, and that it will actually hinder their chances of providing a service. They're the people who should be listened to, not the party members who aren't taking in the actual opinions of the people who are working on the ground. And second to that, it's going to cost £1.5 billion at least to make these changes. You know, there's a young girl in Northampton, she's called Neem. You can follow her plight at Neem's Next Step. She's got cancer and she can't get her treatment in this country, so her family are having to find hundreds of thousands of pounds to take her over to America to get treatment. Why don't we use this money to actually give treatments to people who are in desperate need to save their lives in this country, instead of, I don't know, winning votes by doing something that might be popular to some, but not the people who are actually working in that industry.
Well, I think once again, I've mentioned the word sentimentality. The NHS is the great sacred cow of British politics, about which it is forbidden to think seriously under any circumstances whatever. Clark, of course, is a trade unionist, and what we heard now was trade union speaking under trade union, particularly the BMA. We have this weird notion that we are introducing privatisation. Do you know what your GP is? Your GP is self-employed. He is bought into a partnership. He is running that business at as much profit as possible. The BMA negotiated much better than the Footballers' Union with the weak-spined Labour government, and they did this brilliant deal. They scrapped seeing you at night. Do you know what Labour was stupid enough to value that as? £10,000 a year. This is why we have a health service run for the convenience of the professionals, not for us. It is demented, with my own GP's practice, not my private one, but my NHS, that it takes 2 days to get a prescription signed. That they are closed promptly at 5:30 on Friday night, and you try getting a peep out of them for the whole of the weekend. I'm sorry, and do you know how much they're paid for this little caper? A minimum of 100,000 and up to £250,000. Now that's where private interest is. If you look in France, doctors are paid half what they're paid in England.
So is the legislation deeply flawed that's being put forward?
I think the legislation is utterly irrelevant to the real problems of the NHS.
Right.
And frankly, the private agonies of the Lib Dems concern me not at all.
I'll tell you what, David.
I'd like to ask where the government got their statistics of how they see that passing budgets back over to GPs is more cost effective.
John Redwood.
Where's that come from?
Well,
why do you think it would be more effective?
They've done work on how much of the overhead they can reduce, and they've already got rid of several thousand posts from the bureaucratic overhead, which will clearly save money, allowing that money to be spent on patient care. Nick Clegg and David Cameron signed a very important preface to the White Paper in the summer of 2010, and it is a very good, clear statement of what they're trying to do. And they were always united on it. It came from both the Liberal Democrat and the Conservative manifestos, and it is spending more of the money on the treatments that people want and giving the patients more opportunity with their GP to choose the treatment. So if you think the treatment is better at a private hospital down the road and it has a contract with your GP, you can go to the private hospital down the road and it'll all be paid for because you are an NHS patient. If your district general hospital is really the tops of that particular thing, you will obviously go to the local district general hospital.
The man here in the front row, and then come to you, Clark. Now.
Yeah, I'd just like to say about we have to look at our hospital in Dewsbury as an example where the money is being wasted. Our Dewsbury hospital about 10 years ago was a 5-star hospital. Right now it's like a 2-star hospital, if I believe correctly, and it's just full of debt. And this happened when the Labour government, our local MP Shahid Malik, he said that he was going to get us money from the Gordon Brown's government to clear this debt, but he didn't. All he did was just refinance this debt, and now all the services are moving away to other hospitals in the area, and it's just for old people and stuff to get to the hospital. They have to travel further now just to get the services which they need and which they have.
Okay. One or two people. And the man in the check shirt with the spectacles at the back there, and then I come to you, Clark, and then we go on. Yes.
What's really disgusting with the NHS are these trade union pilgrims who are paid millions of pounds, some of them, to do absolutely no work and just fund the trade unions. So why are we paying people to do absolutely no work?
Clark Carlisle?
I don't understand what you mean by trade union pilgrims. Who are you referring to?
Some of these people that have been pointed out that are just employed by the taxpayer with taxpayers' money to meant to be doing nursing jobs, for example, but actually just do full-time trade union work. Why aren't these people being stopped being funded by the government and instead, being funded by the trade unions?
Definitely, I completely agree. If you can channel avenues of funding and actually make cuts that directly affect the people who work at the forefront of our NHS, instead of allowing, like you said, bureaucrats or pilgrims to wander around and do a job like that, then I will be in complete and total agreement, even though I'm a unionist myself, voluntary, I might add. But I just wanted to come back to David's statement there, saying that this cushy life for GPs and they're swanning around, clocking off at 5 o'clock. I would defy you or I to spend a day in a GP's life and say that it's cushy, having to do the work that he does, or a doctor's life, or a nurse's life. Talking of pompous and insolent comments, how can we stand here and talk about people who work themselves to the bone?
But they don't. They work a 9 to 5, very comfortable job. And so we really.
And what about the nurses and doctors? They work 9 to 5.
I am talking of a GP's practice. I'm not talking of what goes on in the emergency room. I'm not doing that. Sorry, I was extremely clear about what I said. And until we stop being sentimental and ask hard questions, as the gentleman there was doing over pilgrims, we start looking at the BMA as a totally self-interested trade union. And remember that the founder of the NHS, he's the clue to all of this. And Aaron Bevin said the way he got the doctors on board was by stopping their mouths with gold.
Okay.
And that's been Labour policy ever since.
We're going to move on. And the next question affects Dewsbury in particular because of the racial mix-up of this town, which is, I think, something like 75% white and about 22% or so people of Asian origin. The question's from Marek Hebda, please.
Isn't it time that we accepted that in a number of cities in the UK, racial segregation is a fact of life?
And when you say a fact of life, you mean racial segregation is something that one might as well accept and that nothing should be done about, or that attempts should be made? What's your view?
That it exists. Politicians try, perhaps over decades, have pretended that integration will work. Famously, it was recently said that that's failed. Tonight, of course, there's going to be a programme on Channel 4 exploring this in Bradford. The fact that we can't really deny it, it exists, and it's a fact of life.
Okay, and the Prime Minister spoke about it, about a failure to integrate under state multiculturalism. David Starkey, you've spoken about this before. What do you think?
I think you are right, but I still think it's deplorable. A nation cannot exist without a common core of values. We are trying this extraordinary experiment of being a nation without nationalism. And it seems to me that it's not working.
What do you mean by that?
Well, literally what I said, David.
Well,
when you look at the, well, if you look, for example, sorry, I don't want to keep on going on about the last Labour government, but they did do an awful lot of things, and especially
You'll
in this
upset
area.
the gentleman in the middle there if you do.
But I'm quite happy with that. If you look at the Labour government's attempts at defining Britishness, they actually set up a test. It doesn't consist of questions on British history, British lifestyle. It consists of questions like, when are you entitled to benefits? In other words, it is absolutely outside any notion of nationhood. If you look at what the French set up as their equivalent, it's about the revolution, it's about notions of citizenship and whatever. Now, the real problem, I think, is the way in which multiculturalism has worked. The way multiculturalism has worked, and the Race Relations Acts and whatever, I think are totally well-intentioned. But what they've done is deliberately highlight division. Let me give you an example, which is a very interesting one. You probably know I'm gay. We had the case of a group of Islamic men who I think were actually sentenced to jail for issuing propaganda which said the Quran says that gays should be executed, which undoubtedly the Quran does. That's fine. As the whole Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition did until the day before yesterday. Right. If I, as a homosexual, then say, I think Islam is a vile and disgusting religion which has no place in a modern democratic society, I will have a policeman fingering my neck and dragging me off to jail as well. This is absurd. A mature society would have an Islamic preacher or a radical Christian getting up and saying, I think you, David Starkey, I'm sure the gentleman in the middle there would agree, a disgrace to humanity and should be strung up outside Dewsbury Town Hall. And I would then be able to argue, I think you are an atavistic throwback to the Middle Ages, and although I wouldn't execute you, I would jolly well make sure you had absolutely no rights as a citizen whatever, because you're not a fit member of a democratic liberal society. But unless we restore freedom of speech and engagement, what that Channel 4 programme, and I've seen some previews of it, is about, is getting a group of people who've never talked to each other before to talk to each other, frankly, and no holds barred.
All right.
And that's what we want.
Person in the very back there. Yes. John. The person in the back there with the red pullover on.
Right,
yes.
hi there. As a victim liaison officer and a police volunteer, I work within an area of hate crime. And I think attitudes and comments such as Mr. Starkey's do not help the situation. And all that these questions do is cause issues around racism and bigotry. And I think we need to have a grown-up discussion.
In your opinion, is racial segregation a fact of life?
No, it isn't. It's not a fact of life. What we tend to find is that when individuals are subjected to race hate, they tend to live with individuals from their own background. I think we need to be more welcoming, we need to be more open within society.
Clark Carlisle.
Yeah, well, this is a very pertinent topic for us as an industry because we've had a few high-profile cases of discrimination recently. But going back to Marek's question, I think you have to differentiate between racial segregation in communities and racial discrimination, like the lady just talked about at the back. It is a fact of life that there is racial segregation in amongst our country. You can see by the way that there are strong communities, let's say in Southall, in London, a strong Asian community there where the majority of the signs there are in Urdu or other Asian languages. That is a fact, and like attracts like. So if you were going to come over to this country, you're more likely to go where there is a dense population of people from your own background. That is fact. But that doesn't mean to say that we have to accept that racial discrimination or homophobic discrimination or faith discrimination, Islamophobia of any kind should be acceptable within our society. There have been fantastic campaigns within football recently to try and break down those barriers, but in light of recent events, we have realised that we've become quite complacent. We do work hard at total inclusion. We do work hard at breaking down the barriers of racial separation or homophobic discrimination, and we want everyone to feel that they have a place within football. But football is reflective of society. We don't create ideas within our industry. We take players from their local community. So race and racial discrimination is a society problem that we have to tackle head on. And there's a real reluctance to even acknowledge the elephant in the room. And it's really getting on my nerves, you know, to say that racial discrimination doesn't exist is a lie. It happens up and down the country on a daily basis. To say that discrimination due to religion or faith doesn't happen is a lie. It happens on a daily basis, and the same with homophobia. What we have to attack is base level language use and opinion, and that means you don't allow children in the playground to say, oh, that's so gay, or you're a homo, or oh, you're Jewish this, you're Islamic that. We have to re-educate our youngsters so that they know what is acceptable.
Just like
and also,
Chairman
David,
Mao.
please let me
Just
say,
like
before you
Chairman
interject, And also, we have to engage our maturer members of society who might have preconceived ideas into discourse and interaction between the groups so that they can learn the similarities between one another and not focus on the differences.
Thank you, Claire. The woman here.
Whilst appreciating the importance of common values, it just strikes me that why do those common values always have to be based on an archaic and abstract concept of Britishness rather than picked from the strength and diversity within our communities? Because I feel that the difference is something that we should be celebrating, whereas the current government seems to want to eradicate all different and diversity completely.
Well, yeah, what the Prime Minister said... What the Prime Minister said was, under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we've encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and the mainstream. John Redwood, was he right to say that, do you think?
Well, he's the Prime Minister, so I'm sure he had every right to say it, but...
I didn't say, did he have the right to say it? I said, was he right to say it?
Let me say what I would like to say about the subject. I mean, I loathe racial abuse and racial tension, and I think we all need to work endlessly to ensure that people do not use extreme language to inflame extreme opinions. Of course, David Starkey is right that a thriving democracy needs strong exchange of opinions on the things that matter and the things we have to decide together. But if you allow that to stray into extreme language, trying to divide people because of what they look like or because of their creed or their race, then I think you have evil on your doorstep, and it is very difficult to control it. And I'm glad that there are other people in football who are trying to control it. On the terraces, I think it looks dreadful. We are now a different country from the one we were 30 years ago. We should take strength from the many different people who have settled here and wish to be part of our community. I do agree with David Starkey that it is up to the cultural leaders and the political leaders to offer a story of our country that we can all unite behind. And I'm very proud of the story of these islands and the peoples who settled in them from previous centuries. David tells that story very well. But we need to recognise that the story has moved on in the last 30 or 40 years, and we need to be proud of that part of the story as well.
Okay. The man there in the third row.
I don't think there's anything archaic about the idea of Britishness. I think that being British has nothing to do with the colour of your skin, your creed or anything. It's just the general idea. And it might sound a bit of a stereotype, but it's about fair play, it's about queuing, it's about following the rules. It's not, and we shouldn't, celebrating differences it's just the worst thing you can possibly do. We need a cohesive society. We need, well, one nation.
The question from Mark Hebder was that you have to accept that there is racial segregation in a number of cities, Joe Swinson, and the Prime Minister says that the government policy has led to people living apart from each other. In other words, that's the effect of multiculturalism. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that in a number of cities there are parts of that city and neighbourhoods which have a predominance of a particular ethnic group living within them. I think we know that is the case, and to deny that would be strange. But it's not perhaps quite such a cause for pessimism as perhaps has been suggested, because I actually think there's a lot of areas where, despite people living in particular areas, there's still a lot of integration. I think about Glasgow, where I'm from, and there's a very large and proud Scottish Asian community that combines very much feeling Scottish with feeling Asian, and there will be specific cultural and religious practices that are still respected, but at the same time, when the Glasgow Half Marathon runs through the city, you go through the area that's where a lot of Sikh people live, and they come out and support it and hand out oranges, and it's a sort of joyous celebration. So I think that you actually can have a lot of that integration. I think a lot does happen in schools, and that's where part of the difficulty can be, where specific concentrations of particular populations means that schooling can become quite segregated. And in fact, children are born without these kind of prejudices and are just very accepting. And so actually it's one of the best ways to try to break down the barriers. I also think sometimes the media doesn't always help. Because when I speak to Muslim friends, there's very often a real frustration that the very extreme characterisation that David has put forward about Islam is the one that carries favour as if that is what all Muslims think, and actually the voice of mainstream moderate Islam is often not heard. And so I think we need to be careful in our debates as well not to go for that polarisation, because very often tensions are born out of a fear of the unknown, and if we can have perhaps a more informed and intelligent debate about it, we can break down those barriers.
The woman on the gangway there.
There's a minority of bad people in every community and there's a majority of good people. But like the lady just said, there's always, the media is always sort of like influencing on one culture or one community, and that makes the whole of the majority look bad. Like what David Starkey's just said, he's picked an example of Islam. You can pick an example of Judaism or Christianity. It's all, you know, every religion has biasness in it. You cannot always concentrate on one community. But there's always going to be segregation because the media actually influences everyone in a big way to think this community is bad. So the communities do segregate. You can't help it, even if you do live in Britain.
Okay, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that lady, and also pay tribute to what Clark has said. I think it's given, you know, just such a strong defence of, you know, against discrimination and against bringing people together. So I think that's just so important.
What about multiculturalism? What about what the Prime Minister said?
Well, let me just answer Marique's question, because Marique said, do we have to accept it as a fact of life? And I think people in the audience have said in some places it exists, that segregation, but as the lady at the back said, it doesn't have to be a fact of life. Things don't have to be like that. In my own constituency, just up the road in Leeds, the church where I go, a year and a half ago, raised money with a concert for the victims of the floods in Pakistan. This weekend, on Sunday, I'm going to the mosque in my constituency, which has opened up to the whole community to share the culture that they have. And the Muslim community, the Sikh community, the Christian community, and people of no faith come together. And I think that's a fantastic example of where racial segregation doesn't exist, and actually people celebrate together what binds us rather than what divides us. And there is so much more.
So the Prime Minister was wrong to say we've failed to provide a vision of a society to which people feel they can belong.
Well, as I said, Marique is right that in some places, Marique is right that in some places, racial segregation does exist, but it doesn't have to be like that. I think that there is more that binds us together, and it's better actually when we celebrate together what makes us British and what brings us together. And I see that in my community. Jo's spoken about it powerfully, what she sees in Glasgow, and I think that's when we're stronger, whether we come from one religion, one background or another.
No. We'll go on to another question. Okay. Thank you very much. Christopher Ferguson, please.
Has the situation in Syria reached a point where Britain and her allies ought to intervene by force, regardless of approval by the Security Council?
Clark Carlisle.
Well, this situation in Syria, it has two separate strands for me. There's the humanitarian element where, just as a human being, you don't want to see any other nation and the population of any other nation undergo the tyranny and the awful events that are going on there. And if, as a country, we can support humanitarian aid, which doesn't mean that we give money to their government to utilise how they want, and we actually give it to the charities who we know are directly giving humanitarian aid on the ground, then I will be all for that. But in answer to your question, Christopher, should we go in with physical support? Now, I spoke last time I was on about my cousin who is serving for our armed forces, and he's currently out on tour again. And they are out there with terrible supplies, with equipment that's not in full working order.
He's where, in Afghanistan?
No, he's actually in Germany, just in between going back to Afghanistan. And they've got terrible supplies. Their equipment isn't in full working order. They feel like they're understaffed and are being badly guided. And that is in the conflict that they're in already. So if we were then going to try and put our troops into another conflict, and then maybe Argentina, if that arises, under-supported and under-equipped, then I would say no, because we can't put the lives of our young men and women who are fighting on a daily basis for us out there at death's door without supplying them properly. And all
right, John Redwood.
No, we should not intervene militarily. The British government is rightly trying to apply diplomatic pressure, and the British government rightly understands that the Arab nations should lead the pressure on Syria as they have most opportunity, and it is more likely the regime there would respond to them than to us. And I'm very pleased that we are not suggesting military intervention. I think this government would not undertake any military intervention without a United Nations resolution as the bare minimum, and it looks as if Russia and China are not prepared to allow such a resolution, and so the issue doesn't arise all the time they block it. Diplomacy is about trying to get Russia and China, who have more influence with the regime in Syria than we do, to move their position. There are some signs tonight that that may be beginning to happen, and they might have more chance, along with the Arab League, in trying to persuade the government in Syria to behave more reasonably towards its people. The scenes are devastating to see on our television. We all feel desperate about them. But I think not only is there not the legal framework, not only do we not have the diplomatic entree with Syria, but also I'm not sure it would be a feasible military task to set our very hard-pressed armed forces.
All right. I'll come back to yes.
I guess that's really the question, right? And we intervened in Kosovo, though, without approval because we recognize that sometimes we have to. So I guess the question is, how many people need to die? How many people do they need to kill before we're going to do something about it?
David Starkey.
Kosovo was a disaster. Kosovo and the Balkans are now a series of United Nations protectorates. They are ungovernable and unsustainable as states. Humanitarian intervention is almost always disastrous. Let me give you an example. It's called France. You will remember Britain and America liberated France. What thanks did we get for it? The French have spent the last 40 years trying to obliterate the shame by doing everything they can to damage Britain and America.
Well, no D-Day, no invasion. We left it to the Russians to sweep across Europe.
No. I'm just saying.
What are you saying?
What I'm trying to do is to illustrate that people don't like being freed. They tend to mistake. They mistake liberators for conquerors, which is exactly what's happened in Afghanistan, which is exactly what's happened in Iraq, which is, a testament of shame to Britain and America, of utter disgrace. And it would be exactly what would happen in Syria. You go in, you become the enemy. Only one person can make you free. It is yourself. Only a country can free itself. The French freed themselves in their revolution. We didn't have humanitarian intervention to save Louis XVI.
But are you serious to say, I'm sorry, just to nail the point, are you saying there should have been no Allied invasion of France?
No, I'm not, David.
To remove the Germans?
We didn't go into France to liberate France, we went into France to destroy Nazi Germany. What I'm trying to do, if, David, you will occasionally detach your mind from your prompt sheet and listen to what people are saying, what I was saying was, people do not like being liberated. The French had to invent a myth of their own liberation. And it's exactly the same in Afghanistan, it's exactly the same in Iraq. It is, thank God, we did it lightly enough in Libya. But, sorry, we have this weird notion, exemplified above all by the, divinely ordained Tony Blair, that you go and give people freedom.
All right, I think we have the point. Thank you very much. The man in the third row there, in the blue. Man in the blue pullover.
If you're saying that, do you not think that the 3 people that died just to save one person who went into Homs to take pictures and do a job, do you not think those 3 people's families are going to suffer due to the fact of us rescuing one person?
Rachel Reeves.
Well, I think that if we're going to intervene in Syria, we have to be pretty certain that we're going to be able to make a difference. And I'm not convinced, as Clark says, that we would be able to make that difference for the better if we intervened in Syria for the reasons that he said, but also without the support of the United Nations, without the support of the Arab League, without the support of the region. I don't think
without the support of the Syrians.
I don't think that will make a difference. And so, reluctantly, I don't think we can intervene militarily. But I think today the United Nations and the Red Cross have got access, and hopefully access will come in the next few days for a humanitarian mission. And I hope that will start to make a difference and will start to get the support to the people in Homs that they so desperately need at the moment. And we've all seen the pictures on the television. It's devastating. And if that can make some difference, then hopefully that will make it better for the people who are there.
Jo Swinson.
Well, everybody will have been moved by the pictures that they've seen. And it's quite right, and at least some good news, that humanitarian aid may now be able to go in following the Security Council's resolution today. But I don't think we should intervene militarily, partly for the reasons that have been outlined by Clark. It's not something that you enter into lightly, and you have to be confident that you can improve things and make it better. Now, I was a strong supporter of the action we took in Libya, where we had the key things that we had in place were that we had the support of the population, we had the support of the Arab League, we had the United Nations resolution. And we just need to look, as David alluded to, of the mess that we got into, the terrible mess of the folly of going into Iraq without a United Nations resolution. We shouldn't be making that mistake again. What we can be doing, short of military action, as well as supporting the humanitarian effort, is continuing the work that we're doing, supporting and capacity building for the Syrian National Council, helping with training about how to make sure that the documentation is taken of the human rights abuses, so that hopefully at some point in the future, when there is a change in Syria and a transition can actually take place in a measured way, that the people that are responsible for these appalling and despicable acts can finally be brought to justice. And I think that has to be the way that we move forward, rather than repeating the mistakes of the past.
Thank you. You, sir, on the left.
I just fail to see the difference between the Libya and Syria. We intervene in Syria, whereas we intervene in Libya, whereas in Syria there's the same problems. There's a dictator, there's a breaches of human rights, and civilians are being killed. So why don't we intervene there?
Okay. And the man up there with spectacles. You, sir. Yes.
Surely the answer is to put political and economic pressure on Russia and China to make them agree with the United Nations.
John Redwood, what do you think the difference is between Libya?
What an absurd remark. What pressure can we bring to bear on China?
John Redwood.
You don't have to
John Redwood.
For God's sake.
So we're trying to deal with the previous point, David, about what is the difference between Libya and Syria. And there are several differences. The first is that in the case of Libya, there was a United Nations resolution. The second is there was a more formed and united opposition with some military prowess and ability. And the third is that it was more accessible and easier militarily. So there were three things that gave our forces a chance, and they did a very good job to support very brave people who were already there at a considerable scale as an opposition. Those conditions are not met, and so in Syria we could make the thing a lot worse. We could kill a lot of people without managing to produce a great opposition movement.
David, just one second. Hold on a second,
because
David.
This is
Hold on, David.
No,
Hold on, David.
This man,
hold on, David.
He raised a really important point.
All right, wait a minute.
Let's try and answer.
Just be patient and wait. The man there in the checked shirt.
Isn't the danger that we try to impart our own ideologies on these countries?
Absolutely.
And bluntly, it doesn't work.
All right.
Quite.
David Starkey, briefly if you can manage.
2 points. You are absolutely right. Underpinning the absurd doctrine of humanitarian intervention is that everybody wants to be a right-on, liberated man or woman with a flag hanging out of the one corner and a bottle swinging at another. The world isn't like that. People want different things, and we need to recognize it. The key point, the key difference between Syria and Libya is that in Syria you have a united regime with an extremely powerful and well-organized army and secret service. Gaddafi deliberately divided and ruled and had a very weak army. This is the key difference. You would face an entirely different level of military opposition in Syria.
Okay. Time's up, I'm afraid. Apologies to those who've got your hands up still. We can't overrun. Next week we're going to be in Guildford with Question Time. We're going to have Eric Pickles on the panel, the Community Secretary, and we're going to have the singer Will Young with us. The week after that we're going to be in St Andrews. So if you'd like to come to Question Time, either Guildford or St Andrews, you can go to our website and apply there, or as you know, you can ring up 0330 123 99 88. My thanks to all our panellists and to you who came here to Dewsbury to take part. Until next Thursday, from Question Time, good night.
Why it's time to give up sovereignty of the Falkland Islands, a case argued by George Galloway, next on BBC One Scotland on This Week with Andrew Neil.
We're counting down to London 2012 with a spectacular concert on the banks of the River Clyde. A unique event featuring over 270 classical musicians and singers, Scottish Olympians, past